So I'm David Ragland, Dr. David Ragland, and I just want to welcome folks to this is a continuation of a previous conversation that we've done um, and been convening with communities of color, particularly BIPOC communities around COVID, around the pandemic that our communities are experiencing so sadly in disproportionate um, rates, and the way this global pandemic has also torn the wool off of the cover of structural violence and injustice that many communities have been suffering and laboring through um, for a long time. Um, and I am on this call from Ramapo Lenape land, who were the original inhabitants. And I want to begin, for me, this conversation and my participation in this conversation with that acknowledgement, and that acknowledgement as a prayer. Um, and I also think it's apropos to do land acknowledgements given the way European settlers transmitted disease as they first came to this land. Um, and Melinda, do you want to continue?
Sure. Welcome, everyone. This is Dr. Melinda Salazar. I come from South American, Colombian, Chibcha, and Ukrainian roots. And for some of us, learning the land upon which we stand and live is been deeply embedded for generations. And for some of us, that land acknowledgement is new. And out of respect for our history and for the new knowledge that we continue to acquire and commit ourselves to. We invite everyone to use the chat feature to mention their names, the land upon which they stand, the original indigenous roots. And if you'd also like to include the municipality from which you come, please feel free to include that as well. Welcome. We're very honored and grateful to hear your voices today, and that you can join us on this second COVID hearing. Thank you.
While you are right, that in the chat feature, I'd also invite you to add your pronouns as an acknowledgement that he and she are not the only ways of people identifying themselves and being acknowledged as well.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Shirley Fabre, and I'm going to start us off with a prayer today as we begin. Thank you for joining us. Dear God, our God of light, make us of those who live our life with light and shine for the benefit of ourselves, for others, and for you always. It takes but a little bit of light to push away darkness. Our God, illuminate us and let not any one of us end this day without being a source of illumination for someone in need of it. Make us of those who give our light without any conditions or qualifications, and make us always the reason that people have hope in this world, and never the reason that people may dread it. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Oh.
So I will go ahead and get started with the introduction of our speaker. My name is Imani Michelle Scott, and I am honored to be working with Dr. David Ragland and Dr. Melinda Salazar of the Truth Telling Project I've known David now for about, I guess, 7, 8 years, and just an amazing person. The work that the Truth Telling Project does to support African American pride and African American strength and energy and the uplifting of our spirits as a collective is just powerful. And it's all done from our hearts. So I am just really honored to be here and to be a part of the Truth Telling Project. I'm also honored to have our guest speaker, Dr. Rodney Lynn. So let me read you a little bit about Dr. Lynn's background. So Dr. Rodney Lynn is Interim Dean, Senior Associate Dean for Academic and Strategic Initiatives, and Associate Professor in the School of Public Health at Georgia State University in Atlanta, Georgia. He serves on the GSU COVID-19 Task Force. Dr. Lynn is the co-principal investigator and deputy director of the GSU Prevention Research Center. The Georgia State University Prevention Research Center works with community organizations, state and local government, residents, and other partners in Clarkston, Georgia, to develop, implement, and evaluate culturally and linguistically appropriate interventions to address the disparities and determinants of health for migrants and refugees, and to disseminate this work at the community, state, and national levels. Dr. Lynn's own research is focused on childhood obesity prevention, school and community health, and the reduction of health disparities. He has a special interest in identifying effective policy and system approaches to increasing physical activity and healthy eating in children, and has published numerous peer-reviewed articles on these topics. I actually had the opportunity to learn about the Prevention Research Center when I was watching a local news broadcast, and was just really amazed with learning about the work that they've been doing in Clarkston, Georgia. It's a small area of the metro Atlanta populace, but there are an immense number of different languages that are spoke there. And I found it really interesting that those language challenges presented challenges to helping individuals address the disparities associated with COVID. And that's when I reached out to the Prevention Research Center. So once again, thank you, Dr. Ragland and Dr. Salazar, for allowing us to have this space with the Truth Telling Project. And thank you, Dr. Lynn, for what I'm sure is going to be an amazing and informative presentation. I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Scott, and to you and your colleagues. I appreciate the invitation to be with you and to share a little bit about my perspectives on what we've been seeing in our country over the last many months, as well as a little bit about the work we do in the Prevention Research Center at Georgia State University. Let me go ahead and share my slides. Is everyone seeing my slides at this point? Can someone just confirm?
Confirmed.
All right, thank you. So the title of my talk, obviously, here is COVID-19 Disparities, Underlying Drivers and Opportunities to Advance Health Equity. I imagine I'm going to cover ground that many of you are familiar with, but I also want to, give my thoughts about where I think we ought to be going, where we should be pointing our energy, and a little bit about the work of the Prevention Research Center as well. Just from an overview standpoint, again, COVID-19 is obviously the most pressing topic that we're talking about, or the one that's in the limelight at the moment. But I want to get underneath that and talk a little bit about unequal systemic discrimination and inequities, the historical roots and persistence of that discrimination, the impact over time, and then make some suggestions around how we might intervene to promote health equity for underrepresented populations. This slide isn't as current as today, but the story it tells is that there's been a tremendous impact and pandemic proportions of COVID-19 cases in the US, across the globe, and in the state of Georgia where I live. This is what we have seen in the headlines during that time. And a lot of this has really said that, individuals from underrepresented communities are disproportionately affected, and that they are quote unquote vulnerable. They're more quote unquote susceptible. And so for BIPOC communities, I mean, that's what we have, that's how we have portrayed, I think, at least out of the gate, the COVID-19 pandemic and its disproportionate impact on BIPOC communities. So, but I also think that it's that we haven't done enough to talk about the underlying drivers. When we look at the disproportionate rates, you can see here that Black Americans relative to white population here is at significantly greater risk and experiencing significant higher death tolls from COVID-19. And, for every ethnic community here, right? Every racial and ethnic category that's reflected here, with the exception of Asian, which happens to be the demographic with the highest income, what we see is a higher death toll from COVID-19 relative to the majority white population. So determinants of health, I don't think this is a surprise to anyone, but as we think about determinants of health, I think it's important for this conversation around COVID that we remember that individuals are nested within a broader context. And while there are individual level factors and lifestyle choices, behaviors, none of those choices, behaviors are made, that's not occurring in a vacuum. Even our biology individually responds to its environment. So depending on the exposures that you have, it can shape health trajectory as well. So individuals are nested in social and community networks, settings like home, school, place of work, community, access to healthcare, all of those, housing, all of those sectors, settings have incredible impact on the health of a population, the health of an individual. And then more broadly, socioeconomic, cultural, and environmental conditions also play an even larger role. So there's all of the things that happen around health are occurring in a broader context. So we talk about these as social determinants of health. When we look at the proportion of our health outcomes that are related to clinical care, as an example, we can see that actually, though we spend most of our time talking about and focusing on clinical care, that at least half of the outcomes around health are dictated by social and economic factors and the physical environment in which we live. So for all the talk about access to healthcare, and I'm not saying that talk's not important, it is, but we need to understand that there are much more significant drivers of health outcomes, and even health behaviors do not occur in a vacuum. They occur in an environment where you have access or don't have access to things. There's greater stress or less stress because of any wider number of factors like socioeconomic status, access to resources, and the exposures you have with the interactions with the criminal justice system and police. All of these things affect outcomes. And so that's really the point, is that we have to think about these foundational social determinants as we think about both clinical care and health behaviors. Um, Here, this is just another way of looking at some of the same issues here. And this is really looking at the things that drive health. And uh, we know that place is really important, neighborhood and physical environment, education, access to food and quality food. We've talked about the healthcare system, community and social context, and economic stability. And all of these, I'm going to, sort of make a case in a moment that there are some large forces affecting all of these determinants. And until we deal with that, we're going to have a difficult time changing the disparities that we observe by race. So let's look at geography and health. This is a map of Atlanta in 1938, and it really shows uh, redlining and the placing of communities and neighborhoods into more or less favorable um, categories. And the best neighborhoods were those in green, and the worst neighborhoods, quote unquote, or hazardous, as this shows, were in red. And the primary determinant for this was race. Um, and so that was 1938. And Atlanta is right in the middle of in terms of downtown Atlanta, right in the middle of this map. And if we fast forward, look in more recent times, we can see that right across the middle of the city and going to the northwest, the same areas that were redlined, there is a significant disparity in uh, uh, life expectancy. And though here we're looking at 13 years of a discrepancy, there are cities across the country where there's 20 years plus in discrepancy between the higher income communities and communities that have lower income and have higher proportions of underrepresented minorities. Just to be clear, the Piedmont Park area and Olympic Park, or the areas just south of there and west of there, I mean, these are a mile or two apart. I mean, we're not talking about a large distance here. And then, if we look at COVID cases today, and this is looking at, by zip code, we see the same thing in the 30318 zip code, which is a predominantly African American income, African American community with lower income, versus 30305, which is a predominantly white community with higher income. You can see the rates of COVID are substantially different, almost 2 times the case rate in Bankhead relative to Buckhead. When we look at cases and deaths by race and ethnicity in Georgia, this is, I think, well known at this point, but you can see the disparities here by race, both for cases and for deaths. This is also shown, I think, more clearly here. As we look at cases, hospitalizations, and deaths, we can see in this table, in this graphic, that American Indian, Alaska Native, Black or African American, and Hispanic or Latino persons are more than 2.5, close to 3 times experiencing higher rates of COVID as it relates to cases. When we look at hospitalizations, 4.5 to 5, over 5 times the rate of hospitalizations. And when we look at deaths, between 1.4 and 2.1 times the rate of death. So, these are really disheartening and troubling. And, one of the things I think we don't talk about enough, and there's not enough focus on, I see it here and there on the news shows. They feature 1 or 2 people that have passed away from COVID. But I don't think we've done a good job at really looking at what is the impact in BIPOC communities where there have been death rates and hospitalization and disability rates, as you see here. What is the impact on families and communities? Uh, I think we need to quantify and qualify that further, because I'm not sure that's fully understood, the gravity of the impact on the family and the community. So, widespread racial inequities. This summer in May, I think was a really important time for our nation as we responded to the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. In the School of Public Health, we established a task force for racial equity and inclusion. We've continued that work, and I also serve on a university task force focused on the same issues. And so we are doing work at Georgia State, but these were really tragic situations that did not have to happen. And the reality is that when we look at the risk of being killed by police in the US, we see, again, African American, American Indian, Alaska Native, Latinx, and even Asian Pacific Islanders, all at higher rates, significantly higher for African American, Latinx, and American Indian, Alaska Native, and high both for men and for women. So these mortality rate ratios are troubling, and reflect recent data from 2018. And then when you look at data sets that really look at traffic stops across the US, and this is a 2020 study that concluded that Black drivers are about 20% more likely to be stopped than white drivers. And once stopped, they're more likely to be searched 1.5 to 2 times, despite being less likely to be found with illicit drugs. So, it really, I think, makes clear that there are some larger systemic issues that have to be addressed. And this data, I think, clearly makes that case. But, if we look more broadly, and I think we should look broadly, racial disparities in school discipline. We have to look at the trajectories we're putting our young people on. And here, if we look at Department of Education suspension data for girls and boys, we see here that Black boys are suspended at 3 times the rate of white boys, and Black girls at 6 times the rate of white girls. And we can look in specific cities around the country. There's some data from New York and from Boston. And what's happening in these cities is even worse than what we're seeing at the national level. 53 times the rate of expulsion for Black girls relative to white girls in New York, 10 times the rate in Boston. And this is unacceptable. And this is the context in which individuals are growing and developing and being either connected to resources and opportunities that advance their life choices or not. And so we need to be cognizant of the data and call it out. When we look at wage gaps, we can see here that white men have higher hourly earnings than every group except Asian men. And we can see that even after we control for education, we continue to see a significant inequity in wages. And wages obviously matter. They provide the resources for individuals and families and communities to flourish or not, and to have the access to all of the things that we know are vital for health and well-being. When we look at resource gaps more broadly, we can see that Black Americans earn 65 cents for every dollar earned by white Americans. And the average Black family has about $10 in assets for every $100 accrued by the average white family. The Federal Reserve in Boston found that household assets average $8 for Black families and about close to $250,000 for white families. So, these are real numbers that reflect persistent, long-standing inequities in assets and access to resources. We talked about healthcare earlier. If we look at the uninsured rate among the non-elderly population by ethnicity, we can see here that while overall the uninsured rate has declined in large part due to the Affordable Care Act, the expansion of Medicaid in states that chose to do that, and those that didn't, I think in many ways did so along political lines to the detriment of their state population and their citizens. But here we can see that we continue to have uninsured individuals, and that Hispanic and Black individuals continue to be uninsured at rates considerably higher than white Americans. In Georgia, we have a real problem, and this is true as well around the country with Black maternal mortality. We're one of the worst in the country in Georgia, and we rank 32 for infant mortality, 45th for low birth weight, and 1 in 5 Black women and 1 in 4 Hispanic women report not seeing a doctor in the prior 12 months due to cost. So we have real impediments in terms of access, both in terms of insurance as well as cost. We should be clear that having insurance doesn't mean that access is necessarily available. If you can't afford the copay, if you can't afford the medication, if you can't afford to take time off of work to take yourself or your child to the doctor, these are access issues, and we have to be cognizant of those and respond to them. So, maybe I've said a lot that many of you already knew. So I want to say a bit more about systemic discrimination and disadvantage. When I talk about systemic discrimination, I'm really talking about unwarranted differential treatment. And there is discrimination happening across many spheres, and they combine to create a system of disadvantage. Barbara Reskin, in her piece called The Race Discrimination System, I think lays this out very masterfully. She challenges us to think about the entire system. We have to look at the forest, not just the trees. We really need to understand that the outcome produced by the system is greater than the sum of its parts. So what's happening in any one subsystem, has one effect, but if you add all that up, the actual outcome is greater than the sum of just adding up each of the subsystems together. So it suggests that there is some larger systemic effect whereby advantage or disadvantage accrues and compounds across systems. When we think about the persistent and ongoing effects of history, slavery, Jim Crow, racism, discrimination, segregation, mass incarceration, which is probably the most recent of these, though we continue to be segregated in many cities across the country. Segregation no longer has the force of law, but continues to operationalize inequity in many ways. So, what are the ongoing and persistent effects of both history and present day, the present day context? I think that's a question we need to really ponder. I mentioned segregation, residential racial segregation. I want to make the case that this is really linked across many subsystems and really historically has been used as a means to facilitate inequities in access to resources, inequity in access to things like schools, healthcare, the type of toxic environmental exposures you may or may not have, food access, access to a built environment that supports health, access to employment opportunities, access to housing, to owning a home. Can you access the capital to do that? And when you think about race discrimination, both by people as well as by systems, and in this case, we're looking at housing and thinking about what sellers can do, what agents do, and what mortgage brokers can do, as well as in real estate pricing and access to capital. Those things really work together to continue to support residential racial segregation. So, even if discrimination only affected where people live, it would create large black-white disparities based on the way that resources and opportunities are connected to place presently. Again, discrimination and disadvantage accrues across subsystems, and I've just provided here some of the subsystems that there's a need to think about. And I made the case about residential racial segregation a moment ago, so I'll just use that. If individuals are isolated or placed in segregated communities that don't have the social and economic resources and opportunities that are needed, then that can tie to the education that children in those communities get. That can tie, education is tied to labor market opportunities. Educational attainment and labor market opportunities are closely tied to one another. I made the case just a second ago about housing and mortgage markets. Where you live, continues to have some impact on that. Access to credit and consumption markets, health services, and the ability to access those in close proximity from your home and in your community. And then obviously discipline, incarceration, and criminal justice, which has also been a part of the presentation in the prior slides I presented. So there's a real need to understand how discrimination creates disadvantage, and that disadvantage accrues throughout the life course and across the many systems that I've presented here. There's lots of headlines about implicit bias, and I want to make the case that implicit bias is real. We should tackle it. It requires our attention. But I also want to make the argument that the problem I'm talking about is much greater than implicit bias. The problem I'm talking about is much greater than individuals unknowingly or unconsciously showing bias in their daily life. I'm talking about discrimination that's embedded, that's deeply rooted in all the systems that I've talked about. And until we really go upstream and acknowledge that and take that on, whether we want to focus on implicit bias or diversity broadly, those things are going to fall far short from changing the outcomes that we're interested in changing. This is a diagram that Barbara Reskin put together in her article on the race discrimination system and emergent discrimination, and it's really an effort to show you how discrimination really connects to so many other areas, and discrimination is a powerful force. And once it affects one subsystem, the other subsystems are also affected. So how do you take on a system that is designed and on a regular basis discriminates and has produces inequitable outcomes? And one of the ways you do that is you ask yourself, what are forces from outside of that system that can act on and impact every system, every subsystem? And there have been some examples, I think, during the Reconstruction period after the Civil War. uh, there was some legislative victories around the abolishment of slavery, uh, Civil Rights Act, the first Civil Rights Act. But one of the problems there is that once the federal government withdrew from the South, then state-sanctioned racial classification and Jim Crow uh, really took root, expanded with resulting terror, violence, and murder. And I think Lyndon B. Johnson, under his presidency, with pressure to act because of the movement around civil rights, his quote unquote Great Society programs yielded a new Civil Rights Act. It yielded, you know, a Voting Rights Act. It, outlawed discrimination in employment and public accommodations. Brown v. Board of Education was passed during that period, and it was actually passed in the 1950s, but didn't really get enforced until the 60s. So these were also, I think, really good examples that were aimed in the right direction, but in many ways they were piecemeal, and over many years their regulatory agencies weren't funded to really enforce these well, and so the enforcement burden really fell on victims, and in many ways that continues to be the case today. So how could we think about what are things that we could do now in terms of an exogenous force that might act on every system and create opportunities for access to social and economic resources and opportunities? One thing, what if we had a cabinet level position dedicated to ending racial discrimination? What if President-elect Biden created such a cabinet level position? And maybe more relevant for this presentation, what if we committed to reshaping place, that is communities, to really think about and ensure that communities, BIPOC communities, have access to the opportunities and resources that are needed to create equity. And so, I think as I think about equity, and I think about is there a leverage point across the entire race discrimination system? Because Barbara Reskin challenges us to think about, when we're thinking about exogenous forces, is there a leverage point? Is there something that we could pull that would really have a wide-reaching impact on the system? And so because segregation has been used, racial residential segregation has been used as a way to operationalize inequity and produce disparities, one of the ways we might act here, and one of the leverage points I would suggest, is place. I'm really thinking about place-based initiatives. Segregation has been the most efficient mechanism for intended and unintended unequal treatment. And segregation has been a central component in the system. I think place is amenable to change. Government can incentivize community development, and there's much that can be done between public and private interest to produce better opportunities and access. Um, there are lots of things we can do, both in terms of shaping the physical environment, access to capital, access to quality schools, food, and so forth. So, disrupting systemic racism then, calls on us to create communities of opportunity. That term is from a 2019 article by David Williams at Harvard. And, I think that it's a really good way to think about what we're trying to do. How do we work in and across BIPOC communities to create communities of opportunity? Our Prevention Research Center at Georgia State works in Clarkston, Georgia. It's a refugee resettlement and migrant gateway city located in DeKalb County, Georgia. DeKalb is a predominantly African-American county. Clarkston itself is relatively small, just about a square mile, but the city actually is larger. That's the city proper, but the limits of Clarkston are a little bit bigger than that. 60 plus languages, more than half of people are foreign born, and higher rates of all the things that we know matter for health in terms of, access to food, employment. We've been looking at the digital divide recently. Language proficiency is a challenge, and transportation and housing as well. So there's a lot when we think about social determinants of health and structure in place that are needed, and that's our focus in the Prevention Research Center. We're working closely with community residents and leaders. We've established a community advisory board. That advisory board is made up of individuals who live in the community, as well as leaders from nonprofits who are focused on serving the community as well. So we're using a community-based participatory approach to organize and work with members of the community. And the community really has representatives from all over the world, as well as native-born individuals. But some of those might include, or not might, they do include Burma, Afghanistan, Colombia, Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Kenya, Liberia, Uganda, Pakistan, Indonesia. I could really go on because there's a long list, but it's a very diverse community.
Shut up.
We've only been working in Clarkston now for about a year through the Prevention Research Center. Some of our team members have been working with Clarkston leaders for a longer time, but in that time we've done some asset mapping to help identify the resources that are available already in the community and make sure that residents are able to access those. We've started and initiated some research activities together with the community, and also doing some training and different activities.
Due to small size and one pair of electrons on atoms.
If somebody needs to mute there. And we're also working through a process with the community to really identify the community's priorities and then to work in partnership with the community to address the stated priorities, be it health or some other social determinant. So we're leveraging additional grant dollars to do that. So as I mentioned, this term communities of opportunity that Williams and Cooper present to us in their 2019 article is really about the transformation of and location of communities that have been historically disadvantaged because of racism and its related systematic underinvestments into places that provide opportunities for education, labor markets, housing markets, credit markets, healthcare, and all the other domains that drive well-being. So that's really what we're striving towards. We really have to think about upstream causes. Thank you. So yeah, we have to think about upstream causes of disparities and how those are tied to place. And we need to change the systems, focus on systems and really provide focus on prioritizing the provision of opportunities and resources that shape health and well-being across a wide range of issues, some that are explicitly health focused and some that really create a context for health and healthy trajectories. If we really want disparities to be reduced or eliminated, then we're going to have to focus on these things to create the kind of trajectory that we're interested in seeing. So just in summary, I started by talking about COVID-19 and its the unbearable toll that it's having on BIPOC communities, and that susceptibility is driven by persistent discrimination and the resulting inequities. And there's a need to acknowledge that and focus on that as we try to also mitigate these excessively high rates. We can and must respond to ensure equity and access resources and opportunities. Both social and economic issues are paramount here. I think academic community partnerships like the one we have in Clarkston can play an important role in partnering with communities to modify place in important ways. Systems ultimately have to be our focus if we're going to be successful. The reality is that the existing systems are producing inequities because that's what they were designed to do, and we need to acknowledge that and begin to restructure and rebuild those systems. So with that, I'm going to stop and just thank you for the opportunity to spend some time with you. I'm happy to take any questions and engage in a discussion with you.
Thank you, Dr. Lynn. You covered a lot of material and I really appreciated it. I was taking a lot of notes. And so what I am going to ask is that if people have questions that you go ahead and post them now. And I think David and I will field those questions as necessary. And if some people feel more comfortable putting their questions in the chat, that you do that. So yes, definitely. Thank you, Dr. Lynn.
And I see that. Yeah, thank you so much. And I just want to reiterate what Dr. Scott said that, so often we hear about COVID without hearing about the context, right? Without hearing about the surrounding issues. And we have Aurora Harris on the call, who is one of the co-founders of We the People in Detroit, one of the groups leading the water crisis, the water shutoffs there. Do you have a question? Do you want to say more about what you put in the chat, Aurora? And I'll just ask you to unmute. All right, go ahead.
Hi everyone. I put in the information on Detroit because it dealt with the public health policies and it's related to what Dr. Lynn was talking about. So I was trying to show how we're connected to what's happening in his area of work in Atlanta and other places, and to also kind of just give everybody an update on what's been happening here. We had some after a long effort to stop the water shutoffs, we finally have gotten some type of a victory to get the water shutoff stopped this year. But I don't want to talk about all that right now. I don't really have a question. I just wanted to connect the work that we were doing to what Dr. Lynn was talking about.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I have a number of questions that I wrote down, but I just want to give other folks a chance to offer any questions. And maybe while we're doing that, I wanted to see if you can maybe just talk a little bit specifically around, how do you see like the place-based kind of transformation, or dealing with these crises, like as connected, like how does that, in the case of COVID, like fit into the national scheme? And then I wonder, are there like broad-based policies like beyond like a person in the Biden administration or a cabinet level position, like maybe projects like reparations that might address, or a truth and reconciliation process or something like that, that could essentially address the kind of way we need to deal with all of these systems at once.
Yeah, thanks for your question. I think, I think there are some examples that I might give. Here in Atlanta, we have a community called East Lake. East Lake was, um, just barely east of downtown, African American community that had every inequity and disparity you could imagine, housing, education, you name it. And with the support of, purpose-built communities, which was an initiative and funding from East Lake Foundation and others, that community, I think is a case study in what a place-based community can do without displacing the people that live there. So, ensuring that children have access to high quality schools, after school and other programs, ensuring that there's affordable housing, ensuring that the built environment is a place that is promoting healthy behaviors, parks, green space, physical activity, to ensure that police and their presence is one that's supportive rather than punitive. So I think there's examples like that. I know the Obama administration put dollars into promised neighborhoods. I know there have been the Harlem Children's Zone. So I think there are case studies, and I think we need to be studying those case studies to understand what are the common themes across those cases that we might extract and apply in new settings or in the communities that we're all working in. So, what was the second question, Dr. Ragland?
It had to do with reparations as one of as a possible like uh, project that could deal with multiple systemic or sub sections of systemic issues.
Yeah, well, I think I made the case in my presentation that access to resources and capital and assets in BIPOC communities is historically rooted, and those inequities persist today. I read a really great piece on reparations as a tool in public health in the last couple of weeks. I could certainly share that afterwards, but I thought it made a really compelling case that reparations really is something that has promise. Now, it didn't get into the details and the nitty gritty of how do you operationalize this? What would this look like? Who would be entitled to what? So, I think those are the places where the discussion and the debate starts to splinter. And so I think it's important for us to really, understand that making a case for reparations broadly is easier to do than operationalizing and implementing that, because that has to happen in either legal or judicial or in a judicial or legislative context. So I think that's where work continues to be needed. I think the question of whether or not reparations would make a difference, I think without question they would. The question is how do you make that happen in a way that will actually get done.
So I just wanted to ask, to kind of build on that, Dr. Lynn, if you can please share access to that article, and I can forward access to that article to persons who are on the call, and also to the Creating Communities of Opportunity article that you referenced. I found that really fascinating. The one by Williamson Cooper, I'm not familiar with that,
Yeah,
but I definitely.
yeah, while we're on this call, I'll try to pull them up and
Okay,
at least
that
put the
would be
titles in.
wonderful.
Yep.
Yeah, I really love the way that you contextualize this whole idea of public health of COVID, which is really more of a micro way of looking at what you consider to be a larger challenge associated with place and with where we are physically with residents, is where we are, where we live. Do you think that that's something, though, that we can ultimately look to the government? Like you mentioned, possibly the Biden administration and creating certain cabinet positions as a way to address this issue with residents. But is it really something that we can look to the government for? Is it something that we have to begin to maybe sort of work on from the inside out?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Certainly uh, in many ways, government has not done what it needed to for communities of color. I understand the concern and the uh, limitations of quote, depending on government. Um, that said, I think when you look at where the resources are, they are in two places when we think about money. They're in the private markets and they're in government because we pay taxes. So those are the two pots of money that obviously individuals also have. That's a third, but um, I'm not saying that government that modifying place cannot happen without government. I believe it can, but at scale, I think it's difficult to think about how to do that without the tools of government. And when I say the tools of government, government has the power to incent or disincent all sorts of behaviors. And if we want private, or companies and organizations, a private sector to locate so that access to healthy food is something that's available in BIPOC communities. You may need some incentives to accomplish that. Government can do that. So that's just one example, but I think that there is a toolbox, the tools of government that allow government to be able to accomplish things more easily than might otherwise be able to be accomplished. So I'm a policy person, so that's a bias I bring to this. But I'm also not blind to the shortfall and the failures of government over time, and so I understand the difficulties of putting faith in a presidential candidate or president or Congress. Our politics is so broken right now that no sane person would, say that this Congress or is going to bring about what it is that BIPOC communities need. So I think we could talk about sort of that topic for some time. How do we produce social change in the current context? I think that's maybe a larger question.
I saw a question in the chat, David. Do you see that?
I do. And that is, so I see two questions. One from Ohin. Can you help me pronounce your name so I don't butcher it? Let me just ask you to unmute.
Oh, hello. Ohinichu.
Ohinichu.
Yeah.
If you want to go ahead and ask your question.
My question is that, first of all, thanks for this platform and for everyone doing incredible to help the community, from Aurora, what she's doing in Detroit. Thank you very much. And I just want to know that, can an intra-community development platform that, either if it's a virtual platform, an app that connects policymakers to entrepreneurs to change agents? Can that platform ensure that progress is not reliant on government funding? So for instance, the profits from one company will be used to fuel another platform's growth, whether it's in the provision of clean water supply or healthcare. How can we develop a comprehensive virtual platform to allow the change to grow?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I'm not sure I can answer it well. You know, and it sounds like what you're asking is, are there ways for intra-community development that is not relying on government funding to produce the kinds of change that I'm talking about? And I think the answer is yes. We've seen that, and I think it's certainly something that we need more of. So, um, you know, I think communities have created funds and you know, leveraged resources and then reinvested those resources or invested those resources to produce things that make a difference for the community and that also produce net revenue that can also be reinvested. So I think the answer is yes. But I guess, again, you know, I'm a policy person. So, and I'm also a public health person. Like, all of this is nested within a larger environment, you know, and it's very difficult for things to happen in a vacuum, for any community to operate in a vacuum so that it is of itself. That's just very difficult, I think, in the context that is the United States. So I think to the extent that there can be a hybrid approach where, yes, communities lead and decide and shape the direction, the vision, and have a lead role in creating their reality. I think that's what we want. But in most cases, that reality is going to have to intersect with government and private sectors. So, you know, that's my sense of it anyway.
Thank you, Daniel, for that question too. So just to sort of, and I guess maybe that was some of my thinking too, when you talked about the East Lake community, when you talked about Promise Neighborhoods, when you talked about the Harlem Children's Zone, were those hybrid programs? Because I plan to do some research and look into those a little bit more, or were those mostly driven by government?
Yeah, I think purpose-built communities, which is, you can Google purpose-built communities, and they
Okay.
have a organization that works and partners with communities across the country. So you're going to see private and public money associated with those kinds of efforts. The Promise Neighborhoods certainly was federal money. The extent to which it required any sort of local match, I'm not sure. I don't remember right off the top of my head. So. I think, you know, purpose-built certainly would be a hybrid model. We've also had some work going on in the west side of Atlanta, which is also an African-American community, that has been, you know, led with those the community leaders. But the Blank Foundation, Arthur Blank Foundation, he owns the Falcons, former Home Depot founder, has put in, you know, many millions. But there's also been a West Side Future Fund that is, you know, created and, you know, sort of leverage the strength of the neighborhood to bring in other private investment as well. So we're seeing public and private investment, and I think both are incredibly valuable. By the way, I added the article on reparations, the link from, it's a New England Journal article. It's in the chat, and I'm going to add the David Williams one here as soon as I can pull it up.
Thank you.
Thank you as well.
And David, there was another question in the chat as well.
Right. I see a question from my good buddy, Jared Washington. It's my roommate from college in undergrad, freshman year, a long time ago. And Jared writes, my question is in reference to those who have disabilities and who are blind. uh, and able to getting resources. Um, and actually, I believe Jared is a Clarkson resident. So let me just unmute Jared and see. Jared, do you want to ask your question publicly about resources and what specific resources you're talking about? Okay, go ahead, try again. Okay, go ahead, Jared.
Okay. Hello, afternoon, everyone. Again, my name is Jared Washington. Hello, David. How are you?
Hey.
And hello, Dr. Lewis and all the other doctors there. How are you guys doing today? Okay. Now, my question, again, I am also a Clarkson resident, and I'm visually impaired. And I'm actually part of a organization, a VIBS, Vision Impaired Black Society, where I'm also trying to get in touch with the resources to also assist in the health disparagement there that we're all discussing here today. So I was just kind of finding out what are some of the resources, some of the ways a person or an organization could get involved and so forth with that there.
Yeah, well, thanks for your question, Jarrett. I think the issue of individuals with disabilities is an important one. We, in the School of Public Health at Georgia State, have a Center for Leadership and Disability, and we are very focused on this as an area. I think as I talk about reshaping place, and I talk about equity and inclusion, this truly means equity and inclusion, and that means individuals with disabilities as well, not as an add-on, but as part of the community. And I think when we think about the needs that different individuals and different subpopulations have, those need to be brought to the table as part of a planning process for what the needs in the community are. So, being a resident of Clarkston yourself, I would be, very interested in connecting with you to hear more about your, experiences and, your thoughts about the needs in Clarkston. We're certainly in the past had summits in Clarkston, would have done one of those in the last couple of months were it not for COVID. So we'll be doing that, this year or this year ahead for sure, to ensure that we have input from people like yourself in the work that we're doing.
No, we would definitely love that. And we're also familiar with, doing everything on the Zoom. So, and we are able to do that if you would like to. So I would love to be able to discuss that with you.
Yeah. Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jared. I wanted to ask a question, sort of going back to COVID for a second. When we think about the long hauler syndrome that we keep hearing about and some of the consequences down the road, are there organizations that are focused on the public health consequences to members of BIPOC communities in the long term? Like, I know that there's focus right now on how many people are dying, not that we're even able to ensure that those are accurate statistics that we're following, but are there organizations or efforts that are looking at studying the impact 2 months, 3 months down the road for persons in BIPOC communities, to your knowledge, Dr. Lynn?
I haven't heard a lot on this topic. I will tell you that in the School of Public Health at Georgia State, we are working right now and almost about to finish up. We have been thinking about children and families in Georgia and the impact of COVID on children and families. And an important part of that for us has been BIPOC communities and children who are underrepresented minorities and are likely to have a disproportionate impact from COVID. So, we had a listening tour over the last few weeks where we spoke to nonprofits that are on the ground in the state. We spoke to the DFACS director in the state, nonprofits that are working to serve children and after school and policy and advocacy and other settings. And so we are now developing an agenda for doing some of what you are describing, which is identifying the ways that COVID has disproportionately impacted BIPOC communities, particularly children, and identifying opportunities for us as a school and more broadly for us as a state to come together to address this. One of the things that we're thinking about and some of the framing for us around this is preventing a lost generation of children because what tends to happen is 5-10 years down the road, you look and you see a group of people that are off track, and you study that group and then you find out it was 5, 10, or 15 years prior, something happened in our country, in our city, in our community that really threw them off course, and they never returned to a healthy trajectory and a healthy development. So we're doing some research in that space, but also moving to action and identifying an agenda for things that we feel like not just the School of Public Health can do. We've brought together other stakeholders and think that there's a need for a larger campaign that would really prioritize and bring people together to make this front and center and make sure that we're taking action.
Thank you. Dr. Salazar, did you have a question? You're on mute. You're on mute.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. I very much appreciate your presentation and analysis. What the data doesn't show, and what you touched on a little bit, is bringing attention to the everyday experiences of what happens to households, what happens to families when loved ones are lost due to COVID, mothers, fathers, and children. And I'm curious if you could say a little bit more about if you've seen any sort of as a counterintuitive way of saying it, but any creative or innovative ways in which households, families have come together at a community level to meet some of their needs, whether it's in childcare or economic strategies, homeschooling, any unintended consequences of the ways in which communities have been adversely affected that are having interesting outcomes.
Thanks for that question. I can't say that immediately a lot comes to mind. I can talk about things that we've been doing in the School of Public Health or through our Prevention Research Center, working closely with our community leaders and members to try to respond. I mean, I don't know that those have been terribly creative. I mean, we've had, issues around literacy. So we've translated pretty much all the CDC guidance you can find into at least 24 languages. And so we have done that, made that available, disseminated it. We've, gone to every apartment complex in Clarkston to provide PPE and information. We've been working, around digital divide with our educational partners. So, I know there are things that we are doing, but in terms of how communities across the state and across the nation are coming together in this difficult time, there's certainly examples around access to food and pantries and people making a difference in their communities that weren't doing this before. So I've seen some of that, but I can't say that I have a compendium of those things documented at this point. But your initial point is one that I would love to spend some more time on, and that is documenting the impact of the disproportionate loss of people, of family members
Right.
in BIPOC communities. What does that mean for ability to generate income for households, to parent children, for the support that's needed in families and in the community more broadly? I think I, I think we haven't talked about that enough, and that needs to be documented and shared and responded to.
And from where my question comes is a lot of what we have observed in places like Afghanistan from NGOs like Habitat for Humanity, who have gone into Afghanistan decades ago to try to create water systems, or where people have addressed initially some natural resource issues, and then what happened as a result of bringing people together to deal with some real practical issues is that other family, women related education, literacy, economic, childcare kinds of things began to organically grow. And I'm wondering if just a question, if there are lessons to be learned by looking at other war-torn countries and applying those lessons here locally.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. I think it takes us back to some of the conversation where people were asking about, government and the role of government, and I think the need for a hybrid sort of approach that, there are assets and resources within communities for them to serve themselves and to respond to challenges that have been posed by COVID. But I think in addition to that, and that needs to be documented because I think there are going to be some incredible stories. But I would be a proponent of a response package from the government that actually funds and provides resources to the communities that have been most impacted to a disproportionate degree. You've been impacted to a larger degree. You need more infusion of resources for your community to have what it needs to successfully recover from that. So. And I don't mean to suggest that money alone is going to fill the gap. The loss of individuals is real, and it has immeasurable impact on those communities. But just as we talked about reparations before, this is not a situation where everyone gets the same thing. People should get support based on their community's experience with COVID and the loss that's been experienced there.
And maybe therein lies your answer, that it could be just too soon. The communities, families are reeling from the loss in their families. So it's, still at that emotional level. Thank you so very much.
Yeah.
And Melinda, I just wanted to share this with everybody. I don't know if you all can see this. This is a mutual aid map. And we've been involved as a group in mutual aid, and these are what communities have done to keep afloat. And if you were to look at Minneapolis and Twin Cities just alone, their network map looks as robust as what I just showed.
Wow.
And I wanted to see if you could, Dr. Lynn, what do you think about like the organic stuff that's already popped up, like mutual aid networks, and like what kind of possibilities like maybe pop up in your mind around those kind of networks, especially because what people are feeling and sensing is that there's more to come.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, I think one, thanks for sharing that. And two, I think one of the things I'm a fan of, I work with communities, I've worked with communities across our state. I'm a big fan of success stories and sharing what you're doing in your community that's working well and transporting that over here and using it in my community. So I think that's one of the things that we could really do here is to hold up these networks and these organic, in some cases, responses that are really infusing the support that's needed during a crisis. How do we identify those and then hold them up and share them, and even help and facilitate support, their expansion and their uptake in other places. So, again, thanks for sharing that.
So, can you guys hear me? You can hear me, right?
We were just having a hard time seeing you.
Sorry. Okay, so I think that we're probably going to be drawing to a close in about 10 minutes or so. I did want to talk about the vaccine a little bit since that's very prominent right now. And I wanted to ask one question, Dr. Lynn. Are you planning to take the vaccine? And the second question is, how are you planning, or how is your Prevention Resource Center planning to deal with the question of the vaccine in areas like Clarkston?
Great question. Knowing what I know today, I plan to get the vaccine. And I say that as someone who had COVID back in mid-March. So this was really before they were even testing. I mean, I had a antibody test afterwards, and so I've even been reading the literature as it relates to, if you had COVID, should you get a vaccine? And what I'm seeing is the answer is yes. So knowing what I know today, yes, the answer is I will certainly, and I have kids will. As soon as it's approved for them, we'll encourage. We'll do that as well. And I know my wife feels the same. So I think it's important for leaders, for people who are looked to as leaders. You can't push other people to do something you're not willing to do. If you have concern, it's fair to just share. Here's my concern, and I think we need to meet people where they are. We need to acknowledge that people have concerns for legitimate reasons. People are rational. They're smart. They've been watching what's been happening over the last many months. Politics has become a part of vaccine approval, unfortunately, or emergency use authorization for different drugs. And so I think just 2 days ago, the chief of staff in the White House indicated that the FDA director needed to step down if he didn't approve the Pfizer vaccine. That kind of language and tactic is just not helpful for building trust, for reassuring people that science is what's actually determining when a vaccine becomes available and that it's safe. So I think to the extent we can keep politics out of science, that's really what we want in terms of how we work with communities and BIPOC communities specifically. I think, as I said, the starting point is understanding and talking to people about where they are. It's not, the starting point isn't, let me give you this vaccine. The starting point is really listening, because we already know that there are concerns, not just in BIPOC communities, by the way. Nationwide there is concern. And I think there's been a increase in willingness, according to surveys, for individuals across the country to take the vaccine, but it's not as high as you might think, given the impact that COVID is having nationwide. So there are things that people are concerned about, and I think we have to acknowledge their concerns and speak to them pointedly, and to the extent that leaders are, walking the walk and not just talking the talk, I think that's going to make a big difference as well. We will obviously do what I'm suggesting in Clarkston. We've already started to talk about that. We obviously have to deal with a lot of languages, so we're dealing with translation issues as well. And what I have said, I'll say again tomorrow morning. I'm supposed to be on a radio show tomorrow morning. you know, people want to talk to me about, you know, why don't, you know, Black people trust, you know, the physicians and the medical establishment. And, you know, I just think, you know, there was another great article I read that just said, you know, it's not really about trust, it's about trustworthiness. You know, it's really about what has the system done to build trust, to show itself as trustworthy. That's really what we ought to be talking about. What is it that the system can do, the medical establishment can do, the government can do to show itself and to earn the trust of its citizens? I think that's really an important point that we, you know, need to drive home repeatedly.
David?
So I'm not sure if there are any more questions, but if there are, we can send them to you. And Jarrett put his information in the chat, and I also gathered it so I can share with you as
I
well.
copied it, so I have his information now. So I appreciate you offering, but I did copy it so that I have it.
Perfect. We just want to thank you. Like, we deeply appreciate you for coming to us with this conversation. And I mean, when like Imani is the person who's been, you know, really spearheading our organizing around educating our communities and sharing information, in part because she, like many of us, have people in our lives who think this is a hoax. It's not a hoax. People are dying, and they're dying of COVID. Of course, people are dying of other things. People are dying of COVID in higher numbers in our communities. And many people on this call have also had COVID as well. And you know, one of our co-founders, Corey Bush, who's just elected to Congress, had COVID. So we are really dealing with this. And we thank you for your work and honor you in your work, and let us know how we can be a part of this work. Not only, you know, in this moment, your conversation and, you know, just the experience of what we've been dealing with has connected so many things and helped us to see like an entire landscape of all that's happening. So we just want to thank you. And I think somebody wants to say hi.
Hello. Well,
And
you know, David.
Cara.
Yeah, David. I just want to say thank you to you and to Amani and the entire team at the Truth Telling Project for inviting me and for engaging in this discussion. It's been a real pleasure for me, and you know, I really hold in high regard the work you all are doing, and I'm happy to know we're working on the same team. So, thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, with a name like Truth Telling Project, we better be telling the truth.
Thank you.
Yes, yes.
And thank everybody who attended as well. And we'll be sharing this and putting everything online soon.